Hello, church. Welcome to another Exodus Mini number 3 for us, actually. Today we're going to be looking at God's providential preparation of Moses that we find in chapter 2. Now, we're going to be looking actually primarily at a couple verses within the passage from this past Sunday, but then also the Sunday coming up, right? First half of chapter 2, second half of chapter 2. Sunday, we're going to be looking at the second half of chapter 2, and there's so much in here. This is a very important chapter for the progression of Moses' story arc, right? And so we got to look at this in more detail on Sunday. And today we're going to be looking at something that's sort of in the shadows a little bit as we think about Moses moving from being a child that was rescued to the leader of the people of Israel, and the preparation that kind of has to happen for him to be that. One of the things that I mentioned on Sunday, this past Sunday, in the first half of chapter 2, is how we have this very stark absence of a mention of God in the whole of chapter 2 until the very, very end. And we see that again. We continue that kind of theme here in this coming Sunday's passage. And so all that we're seeing here, or all that we're, as a reminder, what we're seeing here is God's sort of quiet hand moving before he moves powerfully. Okay, so let me quickly read through the verse that we're going to be looking at on Sunday, the whole verse that we'll be looking at on Sunday. It says, years later, Moses, chapter 2, verses 11 to 25. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you striking your neighbor?" "Who made you a commander and judge over us?" the man replied. "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." When Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian, and he sat down at a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and then they came to draw water and filled the troughs with water to water their father's flocks. Then the shepherds arrived. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, "Why have you come back so quickly today?" And they answered, "An Egyptian has rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flocks." "So where is he?" He asked his daughters. "And why did you leave the man behind? Invite him to eat dinner." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And she gave birth to a son who he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a resident alien in a foreign land." After a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And so God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. So this is the passage we're going to be looking at on Sunday in its entirety. And I read its entirety, even though we're only going to look at one small little verse. But what we see in this is God's providential preparation of Moses to move him from just being a young boy who is rescued to being the leader of the people. A couple of things we saw actually this past week in the first half of chapter 2, in chapter 2, verse 10. And it says, "And when the child," this is Moses, "grew, she, his mother, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son." He became her son. This is not just, we might assume, I guess, let's say it this way, we might assume that in the ancient world, adoption was kind of a second-class citizen or a second-class child or whatever. That's really actually almost the opposite is true in the ancient world. They don't have a concept of biological relation. They don't have a concept of genetics and things like that. So when it says that he became her son, it means that he became her son. I think people from families who don't have any connection to adoption or anything like that, maybe that's a little bit of the assumption. Oh, this your adopted child. Oh, that's somehow different. And anyone who has adoption in their family recognizes, no, this is God's plan. This is God's purpose. This is my child, right? And there's a real and lasting connection there. But in the ancient world, the same thing is true, right? Like we have this very real connection, which means a couple things for us. And right now we're kind of in the game of hypothetical guessing, right? And we need to recognize that. We need to be intellectually honest enough to say we are kind of being making educated guesses here. And one of those things is we can say two things. First, certainly Pharaoh's home is big enough and complicated enough that Pharaoh and Moses being Pharaoh's grandson, right? Moses and Pharaoh are not likely to be buddy-buddy. There's enough going on, probably not going to be the case. We also probably can assume that Pharaoh or Moses being Pharaoh's grandson doesn't necessarily soften Pharaoh's heart towards the Hebrew people, right? There's enough going on that maybe he's not going to be that close to Pharaoh, but being the grandson, he is going to have the privileges and he is going to be educated like a son of Pharaoh would be educated. And so a couple things that we can take from that. So Moses is going to be educated. How is he going to be educated? Our American system of education is reading, it's writing, it's arithmetic, it's math, right? The education system in the ancient world wouldn't necessarily have been about those things. It would have been probably principally writing, especially for the Egyptians. The Egyptians are one of the first people to have kind of a written language, and it's not even really a written language. Hieroglyphics is kind of this kind of hybrid between pictures and words, right? But they would have been able to communicate with a lot of people. And this is the time in human history where language is starting to become more common. Hebrew is actually considered to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, known written language, right? That has survived. It's certainly the oldest, longest used language, but it's considered to be one of the first to actually have been written down. So Moses would have learned writing. He would have learned how to communicate through writing. He would have learned politics. Now he either is learning politics from education, or he's learning politics through osmosis, right? He literally lives in the land of Egypt, in Pharaoh's home for 40 years. That's the time that Moses then flees here in chapter 2. So for 40 years he's seeing politics happen around him, which just naturally he's going to learn it if he's not actively being taught. Probably another thing he's learning is geography, the geography of Egypt, but probably the geography of nations around Egypt. That's a reasonable assumption that we can make. Another is he is probably learning military tactics. Egypt is one of the most powerful military mights on earth at this point, right? Largely because of chariots. The inventors of chariots is a big part of why Egypt is as powerful as they are for as long as they are. But if you're in the court of Pharaoh, you're probably going to either, again, maybe just through seeing it, but probably through education as well. Moses would never have been considered to be like in succession to be a pharaoh, at least not logically, but maybe he was going to be a leader, a military leader, if he would have stayed around. And then again, governing a people would have been a main point of education for any child of a king, any kind of prince or princeling or whatever you would call it, certainly would have been learning how to govern people. And this is giving Moses sort of a foundation, a base for which God to lay the knowledge of the law on, right? and we'll come back to that here in a second. The other thing that we can glean from Moses being a part of Pharaoh's home is that Moses would have been a known entity. Moses is going to leave for 40 years. He's going to be in the wilderness for 40. He's 40 years old whenever he is in Egypt. He's in Egypt for 40 years. He's in the wilderness for 40 years, and then he comes back to the people, and then he goes back into the wilderness for another 40 years, wandering around in the wilderness. But anybody who is a part of a household for 40 years is going to be remembered, right? Again, Prince of Egypt portrays Moses and the Pharaoh who he's saying, "Let my people go to," as being very close brothers, in fact. And that is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but the recognition that Moses would have been known, and that's what gives him the ability, or maybe even the right, to come into the presence of Pharaoh and even to ask the question, or to make the statement, "Let my people go," right? So then in our passage today, we see some more preparation happening. And this is, again, very subtly seen here, but we see that Moses, he's with the priest of Midian, who in chapter 2 is called Reuel, and then in chapter 3, which we'll see here in just a second, it's called Jethro. And the name change is something of conversation for a different point, not in today's mini. But what happens here? He is Moses and Zipporah marry, right? And so Moses is now a part of the priest of Midian's household. Now the question is, who is the priest of Midian? Who is he a priest of? All sorts of questions like that. And there's a lot of debate about it. Some suggest that Jethro is just simply a priest of the gods of Midian. Maybe some suggest that he's a priest of Yahweh. Jethro is kind of an indication to that, and the name change is maybe an indication to that, and a couple different things throughout the story kind of shows us that. Some suggest that maybe Jethro is a priest in the lineage of Melchizedek, who we see in Genesis and in the book of Hebrews, right? Jesus is not a Levite, so he's not a priest in the order of Aaron. He's a priest in the order of Melchizedek, who was before the priesthood, right? Before the law, before this other. And maybe that's what's going on. But regardless, what Moses is experiencing is he's experiencing what we call the cult system. He's experiencing the cult worship of the people, of a group of people, right? And so when we say cult here, we don't mean this in the negative sense. We mean this as a system of practice, a system of actions, right? And that's not a cult, but just simply a cult system. So even if Moses is not seeing Reuel or Jethro worship Yahweh, he's seeing sacrifices, he's seeing a priesthood, he's seeing a temple or a tabernacle type thing, right? And he's getting all these sort of foundational bits of information, right? So like if you were going to learn a new language, you learn a new language like Hebrew, and Hebrew has vowels just like English has vowels. But when you're learning it from English, we call certain vowels A-type vowels, right? If you're learning Hebrew as a Hebrew person, you're not learning an A-type vowel, a letter A-type vowel. You're learning just simply the vowel, the sound. That's the sound, right? But we have to have a baseline of knowledge in order to kind of make connections. And that's what's happening, certainly what's happening if it's not even if it's not worship of Yahweh, it's just simply a baseline of knowledge so that Moses can then apply what God is teaching. Then the last thing, we're cheating a little bit and we're jumping ahead to Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro." There's that name change, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock as far to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Basically, what we see here is for 40 years, Moses is a shepherd in the wilderness that he will eventually wander. Moses is now learning the land. He's getting the lay of the land. He knows where water is. He knows how to survive in the wilderness. And this is all in preparation for the Lord to do amazing things through him as a leader. So Moses is educated. Moses is experienced. Moses is a known entity. All of these things that we can see from this story. So what is your homework for the week? What is your homework for the rest of the week? I want you to think about your life. I want you to think back look back in your life and go, how did God prepare me for what tasks I have in front of me, right? How did God prepare me to be where I'm at, right? Or maybe you're like, well, I'm being prepared. Maybe that's how is God preparing you? And then really kind of for Sunday, what I want you to think about for Sunday is, has that always been easy? Has it always been easy to be prepared by the Lord? And has God ever used maybe the challenges or the trials in our lives to prepare us? And I'll let you take that to your prayer times, take that to your thinking, and I will see you on Sunday.